This opening move, advancing the king's pawn 2 squares, immediately claims central space and opens lines for the queen and king's bishop, initiating common opening principles. This move immediately establishes asymmetrical pawn structures, leading to the sharpest and most complex responses available to black in the opening. This move develops a knight towards the center, preparing for a kingside castling and contesting control of the d4 and e5 squares, which are typical battlegrounds in the Sicilian defense. This move initiates the classical Sicilian defense, where black immediately challenges white's central pawn and prepares to develop pieces to active squares, often leading to dynamic and imbalanced positions. This move, 3, d4, immediately challenges black's central pawn and opens the position, aiming to gain space and active piece play typical of the open Sicilian. This move, cxd4, correctly challenges white's central pawn majority and opens the c-file, a common strategic objective in the Sicilian defense. This move continues the main line of the open Sicilian, developing a piece and preparing to castle, while also challenging black's central pawn control. This developing move, centralizing the knight and attacking white's e4 pawn, is a principal response in the open Sicilian, preparing to contest the center and develop actively. This move, f3, obstructs the natural development of the g2 bishop and creates a pawn weakness on e3, generally considered a positional concession in this variation of the Sicilian defense. This move, nc6, develops a piece and contests the d4 square, a common response in many Sicilian variations that aims to challenge white's central pawn control and prepare for counterplay. This move, c4, enters the classical variation of the Sicilian defense, aiming to control the d5 square and potentially develop a queenside pawn majority while restricting black's central influence. This move transitions towards a more classical pawn structure, aiming to support the d5 break and free the dark-squared bishop. This develops the knight, supporting the central pawn structure and preparing for castling while potentially aiming to control the d5 square. This move, b7, strategically prepares castling kingside and develops a piece towards the center, consolidating black's position in this open Sicilian variation. This move develops the bishop to an active square, supporting the central pawn push and preparing for kingside castling, a typical continuation in many Sicilian variations like the English attack. With the king safely tucked away, black prepares to develop the remaining pieces and challenge white's central pawn majority. This knight repositions to c2, preparing to support a potential b4 advance, reinforcing the kingside pawn structure and allowing the bishop on e3 to remain active on the long diagonal. This central pawn thrust challenges white's d4 pawn and opens lines for black's pieces, aiming to disrupt white's development and create dynamic counterplay in the Sicilian dragon variation. This capture opens the c-file, creating immediate dynamic play and contesting control of the center. This move is a critical transposition into a variation of the accelerated dragon or Sveshnikov Sicilian, where white has already committed to f3, aiming for a slower build-up but potentially creating weaknesses. Black recaptures in the center, opening lines for their pieces and challenging white's central pawn presence. This move is a principled central pawn grab, immediately challenging black's misplaced knight and aiming to disrupt the pawn structure. This exchange of knights aims to simplify the position and challenge white's central pawn majority, while opening the d-file for potential counterplay. This move recaptures the pawn, opening the d-file and creating pressure on black's queenside structure. This move, 12, qc7, aims to develop the queen to a more active square, eyeing the weakened c4 pawn and supporting a potential nb4 jump if white's knight retreats from d5. White's qb5 is a tactical move aiming to exploit the weak d6 pawn and potentially create pressure along the b7-2 diagonal after further piece development. This move develops the bishop to a safe square, preparing to connect the rooks and potentially challenge white's queen. This move activates the rook along the open c-file, putting pressure on black's queenside and preparing for potential tactics involving the d5 pawn. This move threatens the queen and simultaneously targets the c2 knight, aiming to disrupt white's coordination and potentially gain material or positional advantage by forcing an awkward retreat or exchange. This capture immediately exchanges white's knight for black's knight, simplifying the position and removing a key defender of black's queenside, potentially opening avenues for white's rook on the c-file. By capturing the rook with check, black initiates a sequence that forces the exchange of queens, entering an endgame where white's doubled pawns on the c-file pose a long-term structural weakness. White recaptures the bishop on c1, solidifying the material balance and opening a clear diagonal for the queen to potentially exploit the weakened kingside. This move forces the exchange of queens and simplifies the position, leading to an endgame where black's active bishop pair may offer counterplay against white's potentially weak pawn structure. This knight move repositions the piece to a more active central square, aiming to contest key squares and potentially launch an attack on the queenside. This check forces white's king to move, disrupting its defensive structure and allowing black to potentially exploit the weakened kingside by bringing more pieces into the attack. This move creates a king's defensive structure, preparing to support the knight on d5 and also potentially opening lines for the rook. The rook now occupies the open f-file, preparing to support the knight's advance or to participate in future kingside action. Black retreats the bishop to d8 to safeguard it from further attacks and prepare for potential pawn advances on the queenside in the pawn-weakened structure. This move activates the rook to the central open file, contesting white's control and preparing to challenge the d2 bishop's influence. This move repositions the bishop to a more active diagonal, aiming to support the pawn on c3 and potentially pressure black's queenside. This move initiates pawn play on the kingside, aiming to create dynamic imbalances and potentially open lines for your pieces, although it weakens your pawn structure and should be carefully supported. This move 22, e5 aims to gain space in the center and attack black's kingside pawns, potentially creating a passed pawn if white can push further. The move 23, nb4 aims to reposition the knight to a more active square, potentially challenging black's queenside pawn majority or supporting a future advance on the queenside. The bishop moves to a5 to exert pressure on white's queenside pawn structure and prepare for potential exchanges that could open lines for black's remaining pieces. This move aims to dislodge black's strong bishop from a5, which is currently cramping white's position and controlling key diagonals. Capturing the bishop opens the a-file and creates an unbalanced pawn structure, giving white excellent compensation for the sacrificed material due to the open lines and active piece play. This move reroutes the rook to the d-file, aiming to contest the open file and activate the rook in a potentially complex queenside endgame. The king is now actively participating in the endgame, seeking a safer square while centralizing and potentially supporting pawn advances or defending weak points on the kingside. With the king now safely centralized, black aims to improve coordination of the remaining pieces and prepare for potential pawn advances. This move aims to centralize the king, preparing it for the endgame and potentially supporting pawn advances while offering better protection than the current open c-file. The move 28, rc8 repositions the rook to the more active c-file, aiming to pressure white's isolated pawn on c3 and potentially create counterplay along the open file. The move ***29, rg1*** aims to activate the rook on the g-file, potentially supporting a kingside pawn advance or preparing to contest the open file if black's pieces shift. The rook on c4 is actively centralized, controlling the open c-file and pressuring white's queenside pawns, while also preparing to potentially redeploy to other open files or support a pawn advance. This move repositions the rook to a more active file, aiming to challenge black's control and potentially create attacking chances on the kingside. Capturing the rook opens the b-file for your queen and king to potentially become more active, though it weakens your pawn structure and creates a potentially exposed king. This aggressive recapture of the pawn creates an open file for black's rook, potentially leading to a dangerous mating attack or significant material gains. The king steps into the action to defend the weak f3 pawn and prepare to support the queenside pawns. This move exchanges the rooks, simplifying into a rook endgame where black's extra pawn on the queenside will become a significant advantage. The king has been activated from its defensive post to become a fighting piece in the endgame, centralizing for greater influence and control. The black king actively moves to the center, initiating a plan to utilize its strength in the endgame and support its remaining pawns. The king is now actively participating in the game, transitioning from its defensive role to a more dynamic one in this simplified endgame. This move prepares to secure the queenside pawns by creating a defensive pawn chain, potentially supporting a future queenside expansion or simply preventing white's king from easily penetrating. This move centralizes the king, preparing to defend the queenside pawns and support the advance of the a-pawn. This move aims to create a passed pawn on the h-file, a common strategic goal in endgames with imbalanced pawn structures, and to restrict the opponent's king's mobility. This pawn sacrifice aims to disrupt white's king's safety by opening lines and creating a passed pawn with subsequent moves, or by forcing exchanges that simplify the position in black's favor. This move aims to consolidate the kingside pawn majority by creating a passed pawn on the g-file, which will require black's attention and potentially distract from their own central play. The move 38, a5 aims to create counterplay and potentially a passed pawn on the queenside, as white's kingside pawn majority is now fixed and vulnerable. The white king consolidates its position on the slightly more active b2 square, preparing to potentially support the advancing kingside pawns and provide a safer haven from any immediate checks. The move 40, a4 aims to create a passed pawn on the queenside by advancing the a-pawn and forcing white to capture it, thereby opening a path for the b-pawn to potentially advance and become a passed pawn itself. The black king marches forward to secure the connected passed pawns, a bold but potentially risky decision given white's remaining king activity. Capturing the pawn simplifies the endgame, leading to a decisive material advantage for white in this king and pawn ending. After the exchange of queens and pawns, the game has simplified considerably, and this move allows the black king to centralize and become more active, preparing to support its remaining pawns in the endgame. With the opponent's king exposed and isolated, consolidating your material advantage by bringing your king into an active defensive role is crucial to securing the win.